Thank you, Ross. Well, it's good to be back here again with you tonight, and the title of the slide there tells you everything. Someone said to me beforehand, creation outside of Genesis, that sounds a little bit kinky. Well, you know, the Bible speaks about creation in more than just the book of Genesis, and what we're going to do is see the unity of Scripture. But we also have another theme that will come up tonight, and that is that we will see how the doctrine of first things shows us how the doctrine of last things will come about and play out. So let's begin as we take a look at this. The whole point is that many different biblical texts speak of God's creation of heaven and earth, of God's creation of the waters, both on the earth and above the expanse. It talks about the creation of man, the creation of animals, his control over the stars, and all of the things in the universe. So there's a lot in the Scripture about this topic. When we just think a little bit about what shows up in Scripture, we have passages outside Genesis in the Old Testament itself that refer to Adam. We know of Adam being referred to in 1 Corinthians 15, Romans chapter 5 in the New Testament, but we often don't stop to remember or think that actually you have Adam referred to in Deuteronomy chapter 32 verse 8, Job 31:33, 1 Chronicles 1:1, all mention Adam as though he is an historical person. Surprised at that? Not at all. After all, the record in Genesis is historical. Jesus refers to events in the first 7 chapters of Genesis 15 separate times in the Gospels. And when we go further than that, and we look at the entire New Testament, we find that the New Testament makes reference to Genesis chapters 1 through 11 over 100 different times. Now, 9 of those are direct quotations from the first 2 chapters of Genesis. Direct quotations. And we look at that and we see that there are many other references. Anytime we refer to God creating the stars, or founding the earth, or creating man, or establishing the rules for the movement of the stars, those are references back to creation in Genesis chapter 1. Now, that means then that if we deny the account that we have in Genesis about creation, we bring into question the teachings throughout all of Scripture. It's that simple, it's that basic. When we start denying the historicity of the time frame, the time elements, and the events in Genesis 1, we then put a big question mark over a large part of Scripture. You have 100 references in the New Testament back to those sections that then have been brought into question. And it affects far, far more than just the citing of Scripture. Now, one thing I found very interesting was that sometimes we say, oh, but, you know, I have some science friends and people who have steeped in secular science, and they mock at my view of creation and that I would believe what Genesis 1 has to say. And that is not a new situation for believers to be involved in. Augustine said this, I fear that I will be laughed at by those who have scientific knowledge of these matters and by those who recognize the facts of the case. Think of that. You know, this is not a new situation. And think of this state that science was in at that time to begin with. None of the knowledge of today being involved. And so this is a constant battle and a constant issue that believers must face. And the first thing we must do is to establish where the spiritual authority is. Mark Harwood, in the DVD that we watched, alluded to this. What is our authority? What do we rely upon? What do we rest upon when it comes to any differences in the data or information that we receive? And it's really more the interpretation. Now, we talk about evidence, but evidence has to be interpreted. And evidence being interpreted always gets a subjective interpretation. I'm teaching an Old Testament introduction class in the seminary. We're talking about archaeology. And I'm trying to instill into the students the concept that when you find archaeological artifacts and material, or you excavate sites, you have data, you have evidence, but you have to interpret it. And one person approaching it, one archaeologist, will interpret it differently than another archaeologist because he interprets subjectively for the same reason Ross mentioned earlier. This is not reproducible evidence. We cannot go back and say, okay, let's reproduce what all those events, how they happened, and how these artifacts came to be where they're at. We cannot go into the laboratory. We cannot reproduce it. We're in the area of historical science here, and we have to then use the evidence and circumstantial evidence to reach a reasonable conclusion as to what might have occurred. So what is our authority? That will determine how we approach it and how we interpret the evidence. If our authority is the Lord in His written revelation, we will then approach it differently than someone who says that their authority is the church and its quote-unquote infallible popes. Now that includes people like me, like Ross. It includes your pastor, it includes my pastor, it includes teachers in seminaries, theologians. We are not to be popes, and we're certainly not infallible. All right? Every one of us knows that beyond a shadow of a doubt. And so for people to say, well, I believe it because so-and-so says it, or I believe it because the church says so, that's human authority. That's different than divine authority through His Word. And of course, the ultimate third and final area of choosing one's authority is just to say, well, I am the authority. I myself am my best authority. So we have that authority of human reason with its self-styled sovereignty. Now, these three choices, everyone has to choose and decide what is going to be the authority in the matter of biblical interpretation. And for us, I think that we have to answer the question of which you will follow by saying it's number one that is the most significant, the most important, and the most dependable. Now, how significant is our discussion of Genesis 1 to begin with and creation? Russell Reno is not what you would call an evangelical theologian. But in his new commentary on Genesis, a theological commentary on Genesis, he made this interesting observation. And I found it fascinating because as he goes along, he keeps denying some of the evidence in Genesis. And I say, wait a minute, this doesn't match, it doesn't compute. He says, how we treat the beginning is so fundamental to our overall interpretation of the Bible that reasons for any particular translation are almost coextensive with the articulation of a comprehensive, biblically sensitive theology. Now, he's talking about translation problems in Genesis 1. And he's saying that what we believe about the beginning impacts our theology, and our theology impacts what we believe about the beginning. And we're going to see that work out here tonight. He says, thus, a Christian faith that reads Genesis 1 as outlining the substantive rather than temporal source of creation is well prepared to endorse modern science while rejecting the faux metaphysics of modern scientism. That's false metaphysics. Now, think about that a minute. He's saying that if we read Genesis 1 as just being concepts in substance, a general outline, without historicity and without time involved, then we are prepared to endorse modern science metaphysics. We're ready to accept the view of scientific secular humanism. So he makes this warning himself, and I find it fascinating that he even admits to that. So let's begin our little excursion throughout Scripture. And I'm just going to take you in through